Hello and welcome to Westminster Watch. I'm Nick de Bois. With 2024 behind us, it's time to look ahead to the new year, one that could be even more bursting with news than the last one. For the new British government, it will need to navigate a world of international relations that appears to be getting even more fraught and more unpredictable. And it will also have to implement its domestic policy programme while its popularity plummets. With that in mind, here are our top 5 questions for the Labour government for the year ahead. Number 1. How will the UK approach the end of the Syrian civil war? The government's first major foreign policy test of 2025 is indeed likely to be Syria. President Assad's departure means tens of thousands of refugees may well leave Europe and go home. Number 2. Will the UK be able to help Ukraine reach a peace deal with Russia? The UK has been one of the strongest supporters of Ukraine in its fight with Russia, with both sides now looking towards a peace agreement. How will the UK help? And number 3, what does Trump's return mean for the UK? Donald Trump's return as US president may mean a change in policy over Ukraine. He's also talked about imposing blanket tariffs on imports. So might the UK find itself in the middle of a transatlantic trade war? And number 4, what does resetting the UK's relationship with the EU look like? That's how Keir Starmer has described Labour's approach to relations with the EU. And with the Brexit trade agreement up for review this year, can the government negotiate anything better? And finally, there's the domestic agenda. So question 5, how will Labour do in their first big electoral test in government? Local elections loom in May. Now, after several unpopular decisions, including the end of winter fuel payments and charging farmers inheritance tax, could the government be punished by the public? Well, let's discuss all that and more with my guests. I'm joined by political commentator Alicia Fitzgerald, editor of Conservative Home, Giles Dilnot, and political correspondent at The Spectator, James Heale. Welcome to Westminster all. Well, we have a former Foreign Office Special Advisor here, Giles. So tell us, what will the UK's role and how will they approach getting peace in Syria?
So the first thing I'd say, Nick, is we have to ask whether there is a role for Britain. They're not the first people that everyone went to when Assad fell. I would look more carefully. A lot of people will be crowding around Erdogan in Turkey as seeing him as key to trying to hold this together and make sure that Syria doesn't slide into... there's still doubt as to whether Syria will suddenly change and be, pluralist and have democratic elections. We just don't know at this stage. What Britain might do is exploit its very good relations with Jordan. That would be able, they would be able to, via there, to have some kind of say in the process.
It's interesting. Alicia, let me put this to you. Some might say, given the history of the UK and America in particular in interference in the Middle East, that the best thing they could do is stay out of it.
Well, and we know that that's been Donald Trump's approach so far to it. As soon as Assad, his whole regime fell, that's what Donald Trump said very publicly. He said, hands off, let it happen, let it all play out. This is not one for America. And he actually just said that Syria is not their friend. And I do wonder whether the UK will follow suit, given how much strain there is on the UK and on loads of other European countries at the moment.
Because whatever government emerges, James, actually to look as if it's propped up by the West is the beginning of potential problems, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's going to be the key point about credibility and legitimacy among the Syrian people. The key thing that the UK, I think, has to play in all of this is getting involved in sort of multinational institutions like NATO to put pressure on our allies in Turkey, for instance, and also trying to play a role which is one that is supportive of kind of any moves towards democracy, while, as you say, Nick, being careful not to overstep and make it look as though it's a sort of US-UK puppet regime. It needs to be of the people, by the people, and for the people, and that's going to be the big challenge, I think, in Syria over 2025.
Well, here we are at the beginning of 2025, and of course, it was only 2 weeks ago the news, Giles, was dominated by Ukraine, where effectively Donald Trump, not yet president, has already impacted on the conversation, where you've got Zelensky and Putin both talking about concessions and a ceasefire. This is a good thing, isn't it?
Well, it depends on what the nature of the deal that's thrashed out. But let's just start from first principles. All wars end in negotiation. And this 3-day special operation has become a 3-year war. Russia is getting broken by it. Its influence around the world is being damaged. We're just talking about Syria. That the fact that Russia is focused on Ukraine is one of the reasons why Assad fell so quickly. They've already, the Azerbaijanis took over Nagorno-Karabakh, and the threat of Putin saying, I will step in if you ever do that, just didn't materialise.
So he has been weakened.
So he's been weakened, but Zelensky, very unusually, just before Christmas, said that he revealed 43,000 losses killed in action, and they've been very, very, very shy about revealing how many. They are tired, they are losing manpower, and an attritional war is never going to be in their favour. So I think that Trump is going to try and force them to at least come to the table. Will there be concessions? There'd absolutely have to be. Some of those concessions
But that's huge,
could be
isn't it?
It would be
That's huge. Alicia, aren't we talking here, effectively, of Putin winning if Ukraine gives up land?
Well, I suppose it depends on how you look at it. There are obviously multiple lenses that you can look through and decide what an actual win to this war would be. But obviously it is important because Zelensky always said, pretty much up until this point, that conceding land was not an option for Ukraine. I mean, that was pretty much the objective for them. And
I suppose he had to, though, didn't he?
Well,
really?
exactly.
Yeah.
But it seems that it did take a Trump presidency to somehow shift slightly what his idea of actually an okay deal would be at the end of this. Of course, Zelensky and the whole of Ukraine, they don't want to give up any land. Clearly, that's why they've been fighting such a tough war. But if it looks like there is no end in sight, then it might be a deal worth accepting.
And Trump's taking off the table the one thing that would allow Zelensky to do the possible, and even that's in question, which is to push Russia out. Now, if he's saying, well, you've got to talk because I won't supply you with weapons anymore, Zelensky's got no choice.
And is Europe at one? James, let me ask you this. Is Europe prepared to step in if Trump pulls back? Could Europe step in with the military support?
I'm very sceptical of that, given how much of the support in military aid has been supplied by the US. I think around sort of 60% was the last time I saw the figure cited. I mean, huge sums. And given how little NATO is willing to commit in Europe to its own defence, doing that for another country, a third country for Ukraine, I'm very sceptical of that. And I think we saw that was telling in Starmer's Guildhall speech before Christmas, when he was talking for the first time in talk about sort of negotiation, about moving to the diplomatic table. And I think that was a sign of where the West is moving.
Alicia, it is quite remarkable, isn't it? The man is not yet in office and he is shaping the world already.
I mean, did we expect anything different? It's Donald Trump.
Well, I do remember once that after one election, it was President Bill Clinton, when he beat George Bush, he said there is only one president, and there's only one president, not two. We've only got one president, but it's not Joe Biden.
Well, exactly. And I mean, even before the presidential election, I think especially when Biden actually first stood down, I mean, we barely have seen anything of him since that moment. And I think, to be quite honest, the Democrats lost in a way that for them was quite surprising, not necessarily as surprising maybe for people on the outside, but they didn't think that loss was going to be so severe. I think as a result they are retreating a little bit and just letting Trump kind of take over.
Now, James, I must pick you up on this because Brexit, post-Brexit deal, it was going to be all brilliant trade deals were going to be secured over the world. The Johnson government never got a trade deal with America, and obviously Biden wasn't interested. You could argue Britain's well placed to get a trade deal from Donald Trump, but he's talking about imports. And the EU, apparently, he regards as a socialist land that was never worth doing a deal with. What should Keir Starmer be trying to do?
I think he should be playing the same cards he's been playing for the last couple of weeks or so, which is trying to reject the false choice between Europe and America, as pretty much all his post-war predecessors have done before him. You know, it was Churchill in the 50s who was talking about three circles together overlapping of Commonwealth, Europe and America, and I think Starmer's right to do that because he doesn't know which way yet Trump is going to go. And I think a lot of Trump's politics is posturing and about sort of setting out early stages. He's a big believer in the kind of 80s style idea of sort of trade blocs, and he's always been very much animated by tariffs and protectionism and the kind of threat from Asia. So I'd be interested to see how much that actually comes to reality. The key thing really is just to go over there and be a good ally, and I think play that kind of Atlantic bridge that so many predecessors have tried to do before him.
Does personality matter, Alicia? I mean, Starmer is not the most charismatic of individuals, whereas Donald Trump, the one thing you can say is he's charismatic.
I mean, it's true. I mean, look, they're not naturally typically going to be the best of friends. I mean, in the same way that Theresa May and Donald Trump, they were polar opposites.
How did I know you were going to say that?
But it's
the
strange
famous
though,
hand,
because Theresa May, yes, fine, she was a Conservative Prime Minister, so in terms of ideology, probably a bit closer to the Republicans. But I actually think her relationship with Trump will be quite similar to Keir Starmer's in that they are both quite similar characters. They're both quite rigid, as you said, maybe potentially lacking charisma. It's what lots of the public will say about Starmer. And I think that will be a struggle for them with this relationship, but at least Keir Starmer has some hindsight. We've seen a Trump presidency before. He knows what to expect. To an extent, no one knows what to expect all the time with Trump.
I mean, on that point, Giles, isn't Trump just going to eat Starmer alive in negotiations?
Potentially, but I agree with James. I think Starmer's going to have to sort of play his cards quite carefully. We keep talking. He said that he wanted to reject that false equivalence of it's either America or it's the EU. There are three legs to this stool, and Starmer has already demonstrated that. He's looking at China and talking to China. He's met Xi. Rishi Sunak didn't. And he's talked to him about...
And that's a negotiating position, are you suggesting?
If he goes down the road of trying to build greater economic ties and trade with China, that's going to be a real problem if he starts doing that with trying to deal with America and a trade deal. So he's going to get caught. So he's thinking very carefully where to go. And I think whilst he might reject the idea of a choice between the EU and America, a choice he's going to have to make because some of these are mutually exclusive. The risk, of course, is if you try to play all of them and say, oh, we'll deal with all of you, then all of them tend to ignore you.
Do you think, Giles, coming from the Foreign Office, that Trump will torture David Lammy over his remarks in future meetings when he basically...
Do you know, I don't think he will, but I don't think he'll forget. He has a very long memory for personal things, and, you know, people said at the time, David Lammy, if you aspire
Well, he called him a Nazi, didn't he, basically,
Nazi.
which is something quite a serious thing to do, to call the President of the US a Nazi.
That lunch may well have been very convivial, but and the fact is people deal with whoever they get to deal with. You know, you're the person in post, you're the person in post, we have to talk. But no, I think he's got a long memory, and I think it will be a difficult relationship.
2025, Lookahead, will David Lammy still be in a job as Foreign Secretary?
I think he will. Shortly before Christmas, the Prime Minister's spokesman was asked about whether David Lammy would be kept on for the full 5 years, and they replied instantly yes. I'm not sure David Lammy will be in a job come 2029, but I do think that it would be quite a significant move and an admission of failure, frankly, to move your Foreign Secretary so soon after the election and so after so much effort saying into a reset, and we're going to put a lot of effort onto a stability premium.
Well, we're not off from foreign affairs yet, because as we saw at the end of 24, Rachel Reeves went over and met with all her fellow EU chancellors of the exchequers and said, we're looking to do a deal with you, we're looking to be friends again. Do you think that the Brexit deal, the trade deal that Boris Johnson negotiated, Giles, will be improved upon by a more friendly, chummy Labour Party?
So the first thing is that we were always told there wasn't a deal to do, and a deal did get done. So it is sometimes possible. The point about this is, what is the price? What will the EU is not just going to give it to them because they're nice people. They are going to have to...
Well, they want freedom of movement for young people.
They want freedom of movement, and Starmer's already said that's a red line for him.
What I will say is that quite unanimously across the board, and even from people who very much staunchly voted to leave the EU, people generally don't feel that satisfied with the current deal that we do have. So I think any effort to try and improve that and make it a little bit better, a little bit more constructive for both sides, won't go amiss, that's for sure.
I would just query one thing.
Go on.
Look, obviously, part of their pitch before the election was it's all been awful. Europe thinks we're a joke. It simply isn't true. The relationship between European capitals and London was actually pretty good, largely forged about getting off their backsides and doing something about Ukraine. And so that relationship was actually a lot better than they painted. The relationship with the EU, I would understand, but even that had improved up to a point.
I wasn't specifically talking about the relationship though, I meant more the deal that we have, the Brexit deal we have itself, less about the ties and the so-called cut ties and the relations. It's more about that actual exit deal that we forged that actually, I think, needs some work.
James, what's wrong with a youth mobility scheme? I mean, look, the reality is all we're doing is what we do in every other trade deal, is that we allow, whether it's from India, whether it's going to from an existing deal like Australia, we say, yeah, your young people can come over here and our young people can go over there. What's wrong with the youth mobility?
Because I think it's about interest rather than values. And you could talk about pro-Europeanism, but the fact is the reason why the EU is talking about this is because it has a real problem in Mediterranean countries with youth unemployment. And the fact is that when we were in the EU, most British youth just did not take up the advantage of making that free movement to people across the continent. It's just simply a cultural difference, and now it's about an economic opportunity. That is why they're doing it. And so Starmer's looking at that. He's also very aware about migration, as we've seen at recent Prime Minister's questions. That's going to be something the Tories want to beat him with. It would be the worst thing possible to give Kemi Badenoch an in there and let the Tories attack him on migration.
Well, let's turn to domestic policies. You talked about very well aware of immigration. Alicia, if he conceded, for example, to a youth mobility scheme, is that actually just going to fuel what seems the unstoppable rise of Reform, who are actually leading in some opinion polls now?
I think it's slightly problematic the way that we, not just us, I mean just the media and the country generally and politicians talk about migration, because youth mobility schemes, it's not bad migration. It's not the same migration that I think people are pitching as something really negative for the country. Normally, that is small boats.
But that shows how frightened he is talking about it, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think it's annoying almost that we paint it all with the same brush, because really when you go out and you speak to people on the streets, the migration that they're really annoyed about is illegal migration, and that is minute compared to the overall migration figure. That's not to say we don't need some kind of control for legal migration too, but I feel almost quite bad for young people maybe who are coming from the EU, maybe who wanted to come and study here, who are being painted with the same brush as someone who's arriving here on a small boat
and Reform would make hay, wouldn't they? I mean, let's be clear, they've got 5 MPs now, but they're looking pretty strong.
Nigel Farage has been very clear. He'd said he'd just stop migration. And we were very clear when I was working in the Home Office to say tackling legal migration is a mission to control. That means you can up it or down it to sort out economic issues and labour shortages, that you can actually control it. The only mission to zero was illegal migration, and that's where all the focus is. I think it suits Reform sometimes to draw both together as just one lot and say, you know, those people who are coming here to work and contributing to our economy, they're all the same. It's just migration.
In May, James, there's going to be local elections. They are always the best opinion poll on the performance of a government. So what can Labour expect in 2025 at the local elections, do you think?
I suspect it's going to be a stagnant result for them. I think it's going to be very much the same, because they're obviously not polling great at the moment, and they're going to be going in those seats that were last contested in 2021 at the height of the Boris bounce, the COVID vaccine rollout, Hartlepool was turning blue, all these different things. So they're a very difficult one. The Tories had a very good result last time, so you might see a couple of gains for Labour, but obviously in the polls they're not doing great. So it's going to be a really weird one where the Tories are going to be claiming that somehow that they should be measured against 2024 performance in the general, even though these are not the same seats. These are the most sort of Tory leading areas. County council elections, I think 26 of the 32 authorities are Conservative controlled, either minority or majority going into those elections. So Labour, I think really both sides are going to sort of draw a line under it and ignore the fact that Reform is probably going to do very, very well.
The anxiety that Labour have felt over their decision to take away the winter fuel allowance from pensioners. You've got farmers regularly demonstrating up and down Whitehall with their tractors. I mean, they're picking off lots of groups and annoying them. Will that be reflected in the May elections, do you think, Alicia?
I think it definitely will be reflected, and we've seen that in the polls, and I know that polls are just a bellwether. They aren't necessarily always reflective of reality, but there is something in that for sure. I mean, they were pretty accurate leading up to the election. We knew that Labour would win, quite a big landslide too, so they're still quite accurate now. I think more interestingly is that I don't think this will be a fight between Labour and the Conservatives. I think it will be a fight between Labour and Reform. I think Labour will still obviously come out on top. Reform have a long way to go before they're anywhere near that. But I think the Conservatives are almost out of the picture at the moment in a lot of the conversation, which is, I think, very alarming for them.
And we're moving a kind of 4-party continental style politics in a 2-party system with first past the post. And that's the extraordinary thing. We've got 3 parties in the mid-20s and Lib Dems on about 13%.
I'd agree that the risk in the May elections is for the Conservatives because of the high watermark in 2021. But the fact of the matter is there is a way of dealing with this. First of all, Reform needs local council seats, because that's how they build a ground operation for any kind of assault in a general election to get more seats than they've got at the moment. But the Conservatives can say, it doesn't matter what Nigel Farage says about immigration, it doesn't matter. Lots of people in these areas are concerned about whether their bin is emptied on Thursday regularly, whether or not the streets are safe in their local area. That's where they're going to have to go local to hold it, because we all know that the May elections will be a referendum on whether Kemi's doing well or not.
Well, Alicia, I'm sorry to cut you off there, but I want to ask you this question. Will, at the end of 2025, Kemi Badenoch still be leader of the Conservatives?
I think at the end of 25, definitely.
They're
I
quite
would
ruthless.
maybe hedge my bets a little bit more for by the time we come around to the next election, but clearly that's quite a way off, so I don't want to predict it too much. I think for the Conservatives to have another change in leader after what we saw towards the ends of the last Parliament, I mean, I just don't think that would do anything to rebuild their brand that they really need to rebuild, and I'd be quite surprised if they went for that.
But there's in your own Conservative home, Giles, you're talking about all Conservatives, essentially, in your surveys, see reform as the biggest threat.
They certainly do.
And surely at some point, both the leader of Reform, Nigel Farage, and the leader of the Conservatives have got to realise that if you are splitting the vote, it is just ensuring Labour are in power. And isn't that the reality?
So
They've got to do some deal?
That's definitely a reality scenario. I think that they need to make an argument that maybe can bring back some of those Reform voters, but don't close the door on a deal. A lot of some of the leadership election, the pitch was, we're not going to do any deals with them. We are not Reform. We don't want anything. We'd like their voters back. We'll build a platform that they can get behind and come back to us. They shouldn't shut the door on it, because you're right. If the maths just becomes literally we're fighting each other and ensuring a Labour victory, you have lost the argument you had at the 24 election, which was true, that a vote for Reform literally ensured a large Labour majority.
James, on one level, in many ways, it feels to a lot of people that Reform really don't have to do anything if Labour mess up. If they fail, there's unforgiving for the Conservatives. They haven't been out of power long enough, so people are inclined to say, well, I'm not going to back the Conservatives. If Labour have let them down, that is the moment a fourth party like Reform could come through, isn't it? Even under our system?
Absolutely, and I think what's striking is I was having a conversation the other day with someone involved in the Gaza Independence, and they were talking to me about sort of the different sentiments and the sense of voter dissatisfaction. And I think a lot of the sentiments, if you talk to people from Reform and some of the people on the left as well, they're very similar, the sort of horseshoe theory. I think that there's a lot of anger out there. I think voters are much more willing to shop around for their choice. I think that people are trying to, the rival parties are trying to break the habit of people going and always voting Tory all their life, voting Labour all their life. And I think that is a very volatile climate to operate in. And as you say, Nick, people will just go to Reform as the best vehicle of choice. And that is the danger of the Conservatives in the first past the post. There are swathes of the country right now, places like Ed Miliband's seat, Yvette Cooper's seat in the north of England, where the main opposition next time will be Reform. And suddenly, if the Conservatives in a two-horse race are not involved in that anymore, they will switch to Reform, and they'll become Labour Reform seats rather than Labour Tory seats, as we've known for so many generations.
I also think we need to think about young people in this and how Reform are gaining so much just in the way that they are targeting.
Vote, it's called, I'm told.
But it's true, and I often think, I know, if you open any kind of like TikTok or Instagram Reels or any of these kinds of things, Nigel Farage is on there every single day, and I think what he's doing that is working for people, and it's not just people who are interested in politics and who are maybe right-wing already, like this so-called bro vote. He's engaging people who aren't interested in politics because he's making it digestible for them. He's not making it elitist. He's talking about very relatable things. And I think that's what the other parties are not doing.
They've got a lot of work to do, though, on the youth vote, because Reform is not actually that popular amongst the young. And so I can see why he's doing it, and obviously that's something he needs to do, and the Conservatives will try and contest him for that. But he's got a lot of work to do with the youth vote.
Next year we're going to see the first time 16 to 18-year-olds get the vote in Wales and Scotland as well, so we can test all these hypotheses and see just how well they are doing.
Wales will be key.
Yeah.
Right, everybody, this is it. It's exam time. I'm going to ask you your prediction for this year. What will we probably be talking about at the end of 2025?
At the end of 2025, I think we will be talking about some of the things we've talked about just now. We will now know the answer to the question, are the Conservatives being vied for in opposition by Reform? We will know how far Reform has come and whether it's hype or whether it's actually very real.
And what do you think it will be?
I think they're going to. We are not done yet as a Conservative Party suffering the absorption of that defeat. There is a lot of work to do, and I'm not sure all Conservatives realise that.
Alicia, your prediction?
Can I do one that's not so domestic, but of a
You can
wider
do
one?
what you like.
I think we might see an end to the Russia-Ukraine war, whether that means a concession that isn't ideal for Ukraine. That's definitely on the cards, but I think we might see an end to that conflict, and I mean, definitely hope we do.
James?
I think instability in Europe, and I suspect we'll see another new French Prime Minister and probably a new German Chancellor as well. So I think it's going to be a change everywhere, but probably stability with Keir Starmer, relative stability here at home.
Well, thank you all for joining us here on Westminster Watch. James Heale, Alicia Fitzgerald and Giles Dilnot, your information, your predictions will be logged and brought back to you. Thanks again to my guests for joining me, and don't forget to subscribe to the TRT World YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.